Good day, learners. Welcome to Eko Learners Support for WAEC and NECO candidates. My name is Salau Abubakar Olaoluwa. I will be taking you history. Today, we'll be looking at sources of history. We'll be looking at sources of history. Sources are very important to history because without the sources of history, there is nothing to reconstruct in the past and there is nothing for a researcher to look into in reconstructing whatever that happens in the past. Sources are primary to the study of history. So when we are looking at sources of history, the learning objective which we aim to achieve is that number one, at the end of the lesson, students should be able to explain the importance of sources in history. Number two, discuss the different type of sources in history. Then lastly, outline the advantage and disadvantage of each and different sources of history. Introduction to the sources of history. The study of history relies heavily and solemnly on the sources that are available to the researcher in reconstructing the past. The sources serve as the foundation for our understanding of human civilization and their evolution over time. And without sources, there is nothing like history or the study of history. Then we'll look at the two major categorization of sources in history. We have the primary source and the secondary source. When we look at the primary source are first-hand account or record or event created at the time an event happened or by an eyewitness that actually experienced the event. Primary sources are being regarded as the authentic sources in history. Primary source provide a direct connection to the past, offering a unique perspective on historical events and allowing the researcher to draw their own decision on it. It means that the primary source in history are raw sources that have not been diluted or affected by personal perspective. Then we look at secondary sources. Secondary sources are sources in history that have been reconstructed by a researcher through the contribution of primary sources. Secondary sources already has the personal interpretation of materials by the researcher. The personal idea, orientation, and personal interpretation of the researcher will already reflect in a secondary source. An example of a secondary source are textbook materials that are being done by a researcher. Then we'll go to the sources of history. The first and number one sources of history we'll be looking at is oral tradition. This is the passing of information by the word of mouth from one person to another. Oral tradition is the passing of information or the preservation of knowledge during the period when there is no writing. And oral tradition use the instrument of poetry, idioms, song, folklore, stories, ballads, and genealogy readings to do what? To preserve history. Then we'll look at the advantage and the disadvantage of oral tradition. The first advantage of oral tradition is that it is a primary source. Oral tradition are primary source of history they are raw on their own and they are true to their nature. Information there are being regarded as authentic. Then the second one is they are raw, undiluted. Then the third one is easily accessible. Even sometimes when we are looking at oral tradition, when you source or solicit for information, you easily get it. Whether you attend an event and a song is being sung, through that song you can easily know and understand the history of the people that owns the song. Or during the recitation of genealogy of a person, through the recitation of the genealogy, without even soliciting for information, you will be able to get to know about the history of that person. Then it aids other sources. Oral traditions serve as a collaborative sources to other sources of history. Then also the preservation of history through oral tradition, through this instrument or material that we talk about, which is poetry, song and ballad recitation. History of people in pre-literate society are also being preserved and being kept, and also it determines historical trends and events, because oral tradition talks about how events happens chronologically. It aids chronological order of events. Then we will also look at the disadvantage of oral tradition. Oral tradition is not precise in details, because it just only talks about the point without going into full details of other important things and information that needs to be known. Also, it also involves exaggeration. For example, now people that are being passed information across through the word of mouth can easily exaggerate while narrating the information across to others. Then problem of mixing up facts. Oral tradition has the issue of mixing up facts because of the limitation of human brain. Information can easily be forgotten and be replaced by another one, or information from an event can easily be mistook for the information of another event. Then we also look at the death of informants. Well, when we look at oral tradition, it is being preserved in the memory of human being, and if there is no proper passing across of information from one person to another and the primary informant die, this lead to the end or the demise of such information as well. Then also emphasis on personality and events. Unlike other sources of history that encompasses other aspects of history like cultural activities, social events, oral tradition emphasizes on individuals like the great leaders, king, rulers, monarch, and just important events while overlooking other important aspects of socio-cultural activities of common people within that era. Then we also look at written record and documents. Written record and documents can also be primary or secondary depending on the type of written document. These are written account or giving information about past events. An example can be newspaper, diaries, travelers account. Travelers account, for example, is a primary source of history and is a written document. And when we look at journals are written documents but are secondary sources of history because the writer already input his own perspective about the event they are writing about. Report of commission of inquiry, manifestos of political parties, books and the rest. It also covers most accounts written and documented by early Europeans about African society, because the first early written documents about African sub-Saharan region of Africa is being written by early European explorer before the local language are also being canonized and being written down. Now we'll be looking at the advantage and disadvantage of written records and documents. Number one is that it is easy to use. The information are already written down. It is just to be lifted and be understood by the researcher. Number two, it is accurate and reliable. Unlike oral tradition that can mix facts up, written documents cannot be mixed up. It is genuine and it is authentic. Then it's effective means of keeping record. Written records are more reliable as a source of documenting history and keeping information. Then also promotion of research, provision of detailed information, and it also corroborates other sources. For example, now a written record by an European about an event can be corroborated by the oral tradition of a people within that local society. Then we will look at the disadvantage of written document. First disadvantage is that it could easily be destroyed by termites, fire outbreak, natural disaster, or flood. Then it could be biased and distorted. Be biased and distorted based on the perspective of the person that actually write it down. Even in primary written document, which is being recorded by those that actually experience an event, the perspective or the nature through which the individual who wanted to write the event down sees the event will be a determinant factor in distorting the information that will be written down and be regarded as a primary source. Then it is expensive. For example, now until recent time, when paper is very easy to come about and cheaper to produce, in early 19th century paper is not that easy to come by, and it makes written document hard and difficult to do. Then it is difficult to obtain, because if the people that has it in their possession doesn't release it for you, unlike oral tradition that you can easily listen to it even when you are not soliciting for such information, written document is hard to come by, and it can only be used by educated and literate people. Because if you are not educated, if you are not lettered, if you can't read and write, if you can't understand, even for people that can read and write, if you don't understand the language in which a particular written document is being documented, you won't be able to make use of it. Then we'll also look at the archaeology as a source of history. Archaeology evidence are material remains that has been discovered from site through excavation or through discovery. These physical remains offer insight into the daily lives, technology, and cultural practice of ancient civilization. An example of archaeology materials are potsherd, artifacts, carvings, ruin of society, just like we have the old Oyo city. So those are examples of archaeological remains. Then we'll also look at the advantage and disadvantage of archaeology as a source of history. The first one is that determines the existence of people. Archaeology actually determines that an event truly occurred without any iota of doubt. It gives a credence and is a substantive evidence of history that an event actually happened within a period of time. Also, adaptation of people in the past. It helps us to understand the material remains that are being gotten from archaeological sites or archaeological discovery. Help us to understand the life of people in ancient times. It helps us to understand their lifestyle, the instrument that they use, and we can easily from that deduce how they live their day-to-day, how they do their day-to-day activities. Then it shows the existence of a civilization. The extent of an archaeological ruin or an archaeological artifact also determines the extent of a civilization, because the knowledge, the technology that involved in producing the artifact that had been later discovered shows the advancement level of the society which produced that artifact that is now being discovered today. And evidence of trade contact. For example, now the discovery of cowries, the discovery of coin and the rest also shows that it shows the trade it shows that trade has been in existence and people has been engaging in trade for a long period of time. Then it reveals people's culture, and it also corroborates other sources of history. When we are looking at the disadvantage of archaeology, the first one is a guesswork, because when an archaeological ruin is being discovered or an artifact is being discovered, the researcher will only guess what it could be and what it could be used for. It's not the exact. The researcher will only do a guesswork in determining what it is being used for, because they didn't live in the age at which that material is being used. Then it is very expensive. The archaeology requires a huge amount of money for excavation and preservation of artifacts. Then accidental preservation. One thing is that sometimes the preservation of artifacts that are being discovered are preserved accidentally and not in their true nature. So we can't actually determine if this thing is true the way it is being made or it is being distorted in preservation. Then difficult to interpret. One thing about just like it is a guesswork, it is also very difficult to interpret. For example, now the tablets discovered that ancient people or ancient civilization that left behind are very hard to interpret, because the language through which it is being written are no longer in existence, and nobody can actually understand it. People can only guess what it could mean and what it could be. Then artifacts are easily destroyed. Any artifact, any materials that are not properly preserved can actually be easily destroyed. That is the reason why it is also very expensive to use. Then we'll look at the practice question. The first practice question says, list any 3 material remains that are object of archaeology studies. Then identify any 4 problems associated with archaeological materials. These questions are WAEC questions of the year 2024 WAEC. So the first question that asks about the material remains of archaeological findings are pottery shard, stone tools, ancient coin, bone fragment, burial goods, clay tablets, and metal artifacts. Then when we look at the second question that talks about the problems associated with archaeological materials, then the first one is site destruction. A site can easily be destroyed, and once it is destroyed, it becomes a problem to be used. Then another one is limited financial resources. As we talked before, that archaeological materials is very expensive to use, so the limited financial resources is a disadvantage or problem that is associated with the use of archaeological material. Then ethical dilemma. Ethical dilemma has to do with the ethical issues that arise from the excavation of some sites. Some sites to the local people are sacred and cannot be excavated. So this makes it difficult for researchers to do what? To be able to excavate these places, because the spiritual attachment the spiritual attachment that has to do with this site makes it hard and difficult to be excavated. Just like, for example, in Yoruba land, the Igboro, for example, are places of archaeological remains that can be excavated, but as a result of the traditional rites and spiritual importance of this to traditional religion, it makes it difficult to use. Then fragment evidence. For example, now when we are talking about archaeological site, the evidence that remain are not usually old. Some materials will have gotten lost, and some items can be met in half. Also, the interpretative bias. Just like the researchers does not live in the era at which the event happens, so interpreting the artifact or event becomes biased. Then limited accessibility. It's not everybody that has access to archaeological site or archaeological material. It is limited to the researchers that actually excavate it, or those who can actually pay, or those who sponsor the excavation of the site. It is not accessible to everybody. Thank you very much. That's the end of today's teaching.
Eko Learners Support, a support program of the Lagos State Ministry of Basic and Secondary Education for WAEC and NECO candidates.
If you have any comment, reservation, or observation, please kindly get in touch with us. with the social media links that had been displayed on the screen. Thank you.